Morning, everyone. Welcome to Evolution and Encounter with Faith. And I do intentionally combine the words evolution and faith in the same sentence because I want you to realize, if nothing else, that evolution does require some faith. And today we're going to talk about the theory in the fossils. And again, well, we are going to be recording this, so be aware of that. So let's get going here. So last week, we talked about how could life spontaneously and randomly appear, and we got into some silly numbers, and I dare say I have to use the word stupid, although my wife gets on to me for saying that. We had one chance out of a number with 500 zeros on it. Even your own iPhone quits with 161 zeros. Excel is a little bit more braver, 309, then it quits. And really it's saying is just stop it. This is silly. Why are you working with these numbers? They make no sense. Why are you dare using those? The mercy rule. So today we're going to go to the next step. We're going to assume life happened. We were living and evolution is happening. So what do the fossils tell us? That really is a great way to see what happened in the past. Look at the fossils. Next week, I have two titles. Either it's mutations, recent discovery about their powers, or it's a little bit more negative. It's like you are a mutant and your children are more so. So I'm debating on those titles. And then week 4, I'm probably going to be looking at textbook errors and look at how evolution has changed over time. It's changed really dramatically. Really with each new discovery you hear. We now know. That's a famous line. We now know, so you got to know evolution. You got to know the theory. Don't be afraid of the theory. There was a big bang, the theory says, and then 5 billion years ago or so, the Earth formed, cooled down, life began somehow, and then without life, evolution had something to work on. And through simple random changes, we got more and more complex features in animals. These are driven by mutations that got selected by natural selection, they call it. And the best advanced, the worst did not. And of course, in the beginning, there's no life on here. There's no morals. I have another talk about morals, or really no one has morals if you're an evolutionist. And the short and sweet of that is morals don't change. Yet, when you go from 0 to 100 on the moral scale, morals obviously changed, right? So I won't get into that today. But here we have life. We have strong morals. We have clear purpose today. We still have no God, of course, in primary science. And why are we doing this? What's the big need? Well, I would say even a staunch evolutionist knows why we're doing this. Frank Zindler, an atheist, was debating William Craig. William Craig was kind of giving into that maybe there was no Adam and Eve. Maybe the humans evolved. And Frank takes him to task on it. Takes him to task. You Christian, listen to me. If there never was an Adam and Eve, there never was an original sin. If there's no original sin, there's no need for salvation. If there's no need for salvation, there's no need for a savior. And I submit to you, Mr. Craig, Jesus, whether he's historical or otherwise, that puts him into the ranks of the unemployed. I think that evolution is absolutely the death knell of Christianity. So, even some atheists get it. Some Christians don't. So why am I doing this? Because the message we get on evolution is remarkably consistent. It's proven, it's verifiable, it's not disputed among those who are in the know. So really it's unassailable. And if you question it, at the very least, it proves you're woefully uninformed, at least. So as a Christian, you need to realize the seemingly uncontroversial proof is still quite controversial. The strong, convincing evidence is still on shaky ground. And as an evolutionist, I'm talking about somebody who disavows God, essentially. I want you to realize that faith does permeate your belief system much more than you hope, or I'm sorry, much more than you realize. At least I hope you realize that. Again, a little quick review. We're gonna need this next week for sure. So I want to drill this into your brain, right? Proteins are the workhorses of your body. Lactase is a protein. It breaks down lactose. Some of you lack lactase, and you know it, and you realize that's a problem when you don't have lactase in your body being made to break lactose into the two sugars of glucose and galactose. And you know, proteins form long strings, and they combine into these really cute little tight compact things. And there's a code, right? Your DNA is a code. It gets read. You have your own code. For example, it's only 4 letters, and if you know, if you have a TGG sequence, RNA comes along and gets made. It makes a UGG out of that, and then there's another code. It gets read. This gets read 3 base pairs at a time. If it reads a UGG, it knows, hey, that's a tryptophan. It's programmed that way. It puts a tryptophan right here and keeps reading this and keeps adding to this. It's really cool. Sometimes it screws up. Mutations happen. Instead of a G here, it puts a C there. It reads that UGC and it puts a cysteine there instead of a tryptophan. You have a different protein. You are now a mutant because your DNA changed. You know, mutations happen all the time. You know, 1 bacterium doubles into 2. Possible mutation. Your parents create you. Possible mutation. And I with my apologies to Edwin Starr from back in '69, the song, you know, War, what is it good for? Absolutely. Well, that's not true with mutations. They are actually, they have a purpose. In truth, mutations, there's 1 of 3 possible impacts on you or any organism. And this is very deep, very, very deep. I hope you can grasp this. It can either help you, hurt you, or do nothing. I hope that wasn't too deep. Next week, we look at how they help. And it's possible that you can mutate, change amino acid, and we can't detect. I can't say anything doesn't happen. I'll just say we can't detect it by how we're looking that something happened. It looks neutral. Might not be. So we're going to review Darwin's pillars here of his theory. And we talked about the odds of having life. Now we have to talk about how does life evolve. We have random variation. We now know this to be called random mutations. So now we call it neo-Darwinism instead of Darwinianism. And yes, they happen all the time. You have 100 unique mutations that your parents did not have. We'll deal more about that next week. Then natural selection comes in and it acts on that random variation, those mutations, if they do something. For example, we know these finches that Darwin saw in the Galapagos, they have different types of beaks, purely driven by mutations that got selected for certain tasks. But here's the kicker. You know, Darwin implied, others say, if you repeat 1 and 2, change, select, you know, do it over and over, that leads to integrated, coherent, sophisticated, seemingly purposeful. And I use that word seemingly intentional because it looks intentional, but we know it's not. Those things happen, they say. And I say, what? And again, Darwin's, when he says, you know, random, that's shorthand for it's unguided, it's unplanned by anyone, including and especially God. And keep in mind, you know, up until Darwin's time, naturalists and philosophers, they thought nature, and in life in particular, was overflowing with purpose. Overflowing. So this was a radical concept that Darwin put a exclamation point on. People were already thinking this way prior to the 1860s. So a definition, microevolution, change within a species. You know, we see it happening all the time. But the macro is more what people really mean. And this is the process by which all life on Earth arose from a universal common ancestor by natural selection. You might want to call it differential survival in combination with random mutation. And that's what most mean when referring to evolution. And natural selection sounds like a great mystic force that it's out there, you know, looking and sieving through and picking. But all it means is I can reproduce better than you for whatever reason. That's all it means. There's nothing mystic about natural selection. It's just a very wisely chosen phrase to make people think, it turns out, that is doing, there's something behind the scenes, looking, sitting, doing. No, I can make more babies than you can. They can survive better. And so evolution is kind of from the ground up. But microevolution is within a species. A frog can change a lot of ways, and we know a dog can change a lot of ways, right? And still be a dog. And here's a good example of that microevolution at work here. Look at all these, species. You can have this guy, you can have this guy. These changes are within a kind, a species. They're observable, and really all scientists accept them. They're right there. And a kind or a species is often defined as a group of organisms that can interbreed, producing fertile offspring. Often people say, if this dog, this giant dog here, and this little Chihuahua, pass away and get fossilized, not too far away, and an alien comes around, a million years from now, would they be able to tell that these were actually the same species? Think about it. Think about it when we get into our examples of what people will use for fossils that they use to show progressions, like the whale from a land animal to a aquatic animal. And here's your dog. It's pretty certain now. We know that one genetic source, the wolf, was the originator of the entire dog species, and which tells you it had a lot of genetic capability right from the get-go to make a Chihuahua. To make those giant, I forget what those giant dogs are called, mastiffs, right? They're massive. Then there's macroevolution. We're talking about the acquisition of entirely new body plans. And this is very typical right here, what's seen. This is the typical illustration from evolution showing how smoothly evolution occurs, 5 easy steps from water to land, from fish to reptile. Let's look where Darwin got his beginnings. Darwin's basic belief in random change driving complexity, it wasn't born out of observation initially. No, he had some severe theological objections. He wrote this letter to a lady, I think in the 1850s. He said, I cannot persuade myself, which means I do not believe, that a beneficent, omnipotent God would have designedly created the Ichneumonidae, how to pronounce it out. That's a kind of a parasitic wasp, which with the express intention of their feeding within the living bodies of caterpillars. I had these in my garden last year, my tomato plants. They're pretty cool. Or he said that a cat should play with mice. Not believing this, I see no necessity in the belief that the eye was expressly designed. Okay, what are you saying to us, Darwin? Darwin said, if God's real, he would not have done it that way. Therefore, God, you're not real. So what Darwin was really doing was he chose to believe that a fundamentally random process could produce, as he said, perfection of structure and co-adaptation. He really chose not to believe in God because God failed Darwin's theological test for godhood. So his belief system wasn't rooted in science. That wasn't the core of it. But I'll give him credit. He had his doubts. He said, referring to the existing fossil record that was known in his day in the 1860s, 1850s, when he was thinking these things, he says the abrupt manner in which the whole groups of species suddenly appear in certain formations has been urged by several paleontologists as a factual objection to the belief in Darwinianism, basically. And he says, if numerous species, belonging to some genre or family have really started into life at once, poof, that fact would be fatal to the theory of evolution through natural selection. So he saw flaws and he saw issues within him. Why did he say that? Well, he knew about the fossil record that in where the fossils start, which is in the Precambrian layer. He knew that small soft body fossils were there, and then all of a sudden you have rapid complexity. With no apparent ancestors. That's strange. That kind of doesn't make sense to his theory. But alas, he certainly had hope. He said, keep looking. He said, well, there's damage. Those Precambrian fossils are probably damaged by either heat, pressure, erosion, or too small and fragile for preservation. He said, keep looking. They have to be there, basically. And what he really says, look, we continually forget how large the world is compared to the area which we've already looked. So keep looking, and they're bound to show up. is what he said. Paleontology is a study of fossils. You know, it's really the absolute best, not the only way to look back in the past and see what happened. And that's okay. That's good because there are a lot of fossils. And where do you think you find good fossils? Anybody want to venture a guess? One of the best places in the world? Well, go out west, young man. Grand Canyon, Zion, Bryce.
Yeah.
I've been to all these places. These two are, Zion is my favorite park by far. You go there and you can see the great unconformity. That's where the fossil record begins. So it kind of implies before that, nothing was around. And there's over a mile on average of these layers filled with fossils. And they go thousands of miles. It's crazy. They're so flat, almost like it got laid down very, very fast. I won't go into that right now. But there's also a small layer here called the Cambrian rock, and it's down in the Grand Canyon. And if you take a peek, well, before I go there, guess what we find in these rocks? I already gave it away. What do we find? Anybody? How about billions of dead things buried in that stuff? And really all over the earth. We have these layers on the earth all over. Billions of dead things, fossilized. And you go to the Grand Canyon, you're going to see the great unconformity, where the Precambrian ends and the fossil record begins. It's really cool. So let's go down to the Grand Canyon. You see here's the Cambrian, and only in a few layers above the great unconformity is the Cambrian. And there are a few soft-bodied fossils in Precambrian rock, but the Cambrian period records the appearance of almost all major body types appear suddenly. That's why it's always been called the Cambrian explosion. It appeared to explode. 23 of 27 major phyla appear for the first time, which is really almost all major body types go poof. So the history of life's diversity, according to Darwinian expectations, is this: an ancestor that kind of mutated and began to gradiate all different kinds of animals slowly but widely, like that. But what do we actually see? We see a striking discontinuity. So if you look at Cambrian rock here, and these are all the phyla that appear. They start down here and shoot up. Some things appear later in the record, like this guy here. Some things start and then die off quickly, like this guy. But we see more of an explosion. So scientists now know this. T.S. Kemp, he's a curator of the zoological collections at Oxford University, of no less a place. Natural history, one of the world's foremost experts on Cambrian fossils. He says, with few exceptions, radically new kinds of organisms appear for the first time in the fossil record, already fully formed, evolved, with most of their characteristic features present. It's not at all what we might have expected. He was surprised. And take a note here. I'm only going to quote die-hard evolutionary paleontologists who object to any evolutionary help from some outside intelligence. Okay, so I don't need to quote those crazy Christians or those other kind of folks. So here's a test question. If these are two graphs, and this is time and this is how fast phyla appear, which one do we see in the fossil record? A or B? Anyone will venture a guess? Unmute and answer.
Would it be B?
Ah, you would get the prize. It turns out that's the fact, and this is the theory. This, did it happen slowly? We saw things appear slowly. Another layer, there it is. No, it was like nothing happens and then boom. So, Professor, you care for rebuttal? Yes, Tim, that's true, he would say. But you need to realize evolution is the only possible answer. So the missing transitions seem trivial. Oh, that leaves me a little dissatisfied. Because really, instead of letting the fossils speak to us, the evolutionary paradigm is really being forced on the data. The data should be invoking the paradigm, but we got that backwards somehow. I have some more quotes for Darwin. American paleobiologist William Shope, famous guy, he wrote back in '94, the long-held notion that Precambrian organisms must have been too small or too delicate to have been preserved in geological records or materials is now recognized as incorrect. So Darwin put hope out there. We'll look in that early stuff and we'll find these precursors, and you know, fast forward 140 years later, no. If anything, you know, the abrupt appearance of the major animal phyla, which modern biologists call the Cambrian explosion or biology's Big Bang, it's better documented now than in Darwin's time. You know, according to Berkeley paleontologist James Valentine, his colleagues, the explosion is real and is too big to be masked by flaws in the fossil record. And that's a common thing people say. You know, it's not a perfect record. It has its issues. You know, it's happenstance. Something gets buried at a certain time. He's saying, no, there's so much stuff in there. Come on. There are billions and billions of fossils. Yeah, we might miss some things, but there's got to be some signs of, you know, vertical transactions going on. And he goes on to say, you know, this explosion, it's even more abrupt and extensive than we previously imagined. And that's recent stuff. And Darwin said, hey, guys, keep looking. And now we say, hey, Darwin, wrong. We've been looking for a long time. Why has the evidence disappeared? You know, they say things like fully formed, abrupt, and extensive Cambrian explosion. You know, the message implied is there are missing links. There's missing bones. There's missing links between things. And since Darwin, evolution has always struggled with this fact, even in Darwin's day. And remember, Darwinian evolution must work by tiny changes. Otherwise, if the leap is too big, it looks guided. And that means God or something else. And that's a no-no. But those tiny changes, in order to get passed on, they got to have an advantage, each change. Otherwise, the organism has no reason to keep it. So I'm going to review the basics and try to drill this in your mind here. We'll need this next week, really. You know, evolution must create improvements to be a credible force for change. You know, we have to see complexity evolve. Otherwise, it's useless for that. How this must happen is this. There must be a mutation in the DNA. That mutation must be advantageous for reproduction. You know, your babies have to survive better than the prior, before the change. And what that means is that mutation has to get fixed within all the genome of your species. Everybody has to start carrying that gene. So it has to be good and get passed on and be there all the time. And there's a big issue with this. That's called heredity, of course. And even the evolutionary person, Chimera, he showed very clearly, even when you have a good mutation, it's hard to pass it on. We'll talk about that next week. So, but for now, let's just assume good mutation, it spreads like wildfire. Nothing's going to stop it. And you got to repeat that over and over and over. And before you know it, you have new things happening. Complexity happens. That's it. So evolution doesn't have a compass. Don't forget this. There's no compass. You know, it can't say, I got fins right now. I want to have feet, you know, plus or minus 10 million years. I need to do these things. That's bunk. And if an organism does need, this is a test question, be ready to class, here's a test question. If an organism needs a particular improvement to survive, mutations that favor that improvement will increase in number. Jeopardy music is going now. What's your answer? I need a mutation. Evolution is going to kind of give you a wink and nod and help you out. Will it? Yes or no? Anyone want to guess?
I want to say no.
And you would be absolutely right. No, just because you need a mutation to happen, it's random. And it has no vision of the future. It's just random. So no, the number that you need will not increase. It'll be the same as it always has, no matter. And you've maybe heard, oh, the giraffe, its neck grew because it needed to reach the higher trees. Therefore, I've heard this, that mutation frequency increased. No, it doesn't increase. It's just as low as it was before. So now, let's evolve, people. And my professor said, yeah, Tim, that's true. It's the only, but evolution is the only possible answer. And he says, besides, Mr. Cooper, getting a little perturbed at me, we have clear theory and proof that life continued to evolve and still continues to evolve. Okay, let's look at the fossil record, see what it says after this Cambrian explosion happened. Here's your typical 20 million years, fish goes to reptile. Lungs happen, feet happen, a lot of things happen. That's your typical thing you see in a textbook. And really, it's all about the presentation. 5 easy steps, fish to reptile. How could anyone doubt we evolved from a fish? This is wonderful detail. I would say, thank you, professor, but some things seem missing here. What am I talking about? Well, for example, here's your fish. Before you even get started, can we even make a fish? Dr. Alfred Romer of Harvard, he was the nation's leading paleontologist back before he died in the 70s. He says, if you go back to the sediments of the Silurian early Devonian age, we see numerous fish-like vertebrates of various types present. And it's obvious they had a long evolutionary history had taken place. But of this history, we are mainly ignorant. Translation, there should be a lot of fossils getting here. We have zero. That's the translation. Odd. And if I want to go from a fish to amphibian, it's not a small change. Remember, evolution is a very slow process. If C here clearly evolved from B, he has acquired some neat features, right? Well, he can walk a little bit. He can breathe air. That's pretty cool. There would be hundreds of millions of mutations between these two. Not to mention, the formation of extreme innovation that happened. So being generous, there would be, say, hundreds of steps from here to here. That's hundreds of unique advancing stages as I get to become a walking, breathing thing. Now, each step is unique, is a unique thriving species of a new organism. And like steps of the fish now, we have no history how this happened. So we're talking about missing links. So let's look at these two here. Let's look at our walking, breathing fish here. And of course, you know me, I'm always generous when I do these things. Let's imagine just a few mutations, say 3 or 4 DNA base pair changes just in the right spot at the right time. Then the well-functioning fin that he has begins to develop slightly more rigidity. Well, it's on its way to becoming able to support his weight when he walks one day. He doesn't know that, but it's happening. This change would need to be advantageous, such that it favors increased offspring. That little change, he needs to be able to spread his gene pool, so he needs an advantage, differential survival. What's the reality? If I have a well-functioning fin that I need for swimming, imagine me swimming, and it starts to get a little rigid, that's likely going to hurt my survivability in the water. But let's ignore that for the minute. Assume it's advantageous. Time is required to spread that new feature throughout the species to become fixed. At a minimum, we're talking hundreds of small steps and changes in the DNA, gets incorporated. All steps must improve breeding potential. Because if you don't use it, you lose it, right? And so it has to have a purpose. And all those steps get fixed. Each step would require a population with millions. And some fossil record, you think of each step would be there. No, and typically not even close. The complete absence of these hundreds of steps represents hundreds of missing links. And you thought.
So Tim, my question would be, how does that amphibian create a bone in those fins so that he can support himself on land?
Well, he has some lucky mutations that somehow make bone there. See my hands waving? You just have to trust that it happened. Clearly it happened. We don't know how exactly, but clearly because we have fish and we have walking things now. That's all we know. It's a missing link. And I'm thinking a lot of you probably thought there's only one missing link, right? From this guy to this guy. No. the complete absence of these hundreds of steps represents tens of thousands of missing links throughout all evolution. And hundreds, that's a question mark. This all assumes hundreds of steps can occur and account for hundreds of millions of DNA-based pair changes to leave the water and walk. Is that even possible to have those kind of mutations? That's next week.
Tim.
So, look, question?
Yeah. I would ask you, at what point do they start becoming enough? Because you brought up the whole apes and man
Right.
issue, and this is one where it seems like in this school of thought there's a lot of excuses when in a so-called link does show up.
Right.
Because you have what I sense is kind of a moving goalpost, if you know what I mean. Basically, there was the claim that there would be no link between chimpanzees and humans. And then they found one, Lucy. And then there'd be no claim between, or Lucy's just a small version of a human.
Right.
There's not going to be any link between those.
Right.
And then another one shows up.
Right.
And then another one, Homo erectus, Homo habilis. And then they found Turkana not that long ago. And these keep showing up. And it's easy with humans and apes and basically anything that's still alive today. Obviously, if it's something that died a long time ago by anyone's means, dinosaurs, for instance, it's going to be a lot harder.
I see where you're going.
But the ultimate point is, I feel that when this is discussed, there's a lot of excuses that get made
by doubters of evolution.
Sorry, excuse me, I didn't have my volume turned up very high. Could you?
Excuses from people who doubt evolutionary processes can lead to complexity.
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, and so that's, and I've had this conversation with people before, and that's something to the effect of the answers that I kept getting from them. And I mean, and the example of the fish or amphibian to reptile, I mean, mud skippers are a thing. They're fish that live near mangoes, and they support themselves on their fins.
Right.
Because a lot of fins in fish do have either bone or strong collar.
Walking catfish has been proposed. A lot of things have been proposed. I'm going to address your points. I have a very good. I'm going to go with the whale evolutionary series, which is the best one that I think has been put forward as proof that whales evolved from land animals. And then next week, especially next week, we're going to talk about the genetic requirements to get there to make a change, and think about what that takes. And we know new rules now. Maybe the past 5 years, new rules for guiding genetic change, like from a chimp to a human, right? And so we're going to hit that. I hear you. I hear what you're saying, and I'm going to hit that a little bit more in a minute. And the next week, I'm really going to address what you're saying from a mutation genetic tracking standpoint. Great point. Here's a good example. People say, look, there's a fossil. Coelacanth. Maybe you've heard of coelacanth. He's kind of a famous guy. He was on a beer commercial one time. There's dangers when you interpret the fossil record blindly and look for hopeful monsters. because this fish said, rumors of my extinction have been greatly exaggerated. Because prior to 1938, this fish was considered a major evolutionary link between fish and amphibian. It supposedly had limb-like features on its fins that were, advancing towards amphibianhood. It was used as evidence. And since we had no fossils of this fish, the coelacanth, after the Mesozoic era, evolutionists concluded this fish finished its evolution during that period and went away. Now, however, being able to examine the actual living fossil back in 38, when someone caught this fish near South Africa / Madagascar, they could verify that there was no initial advancement towards amphibianhood, just pure speculation. So essentially they said, oh, never mind, we made a mistake there. Someone also forgot to tell a fish to keep evolving, because it stopped evolving apparently over a 300 million period. It decided to stop evolving. That's strange. Okay, so really you get into a lot of armchair speculation, and that's critical. When you want to build a model and you don't have a good proof, you're making guesses until you find a piece of that living model alive, and then the pure speculation becomes apparent. And I've got some good example of that later again. So if you listen to, this is back in the 40s, this guy was the expert. He did mammalian research, George Gaylord Simpson. He said that all 32 orders of mammals in the system, they appear suddenly and no fossils. But he said, hey, this regular absence of transitional forms is not confined to mammals. It's a universal phenomenon. And paleontologists have known this for a long time. And you want to build a bird? The origin of the bird is largely a pure matter of deduction. There's no fossil evidence of the stages through which this happened. And we're going to look at that in a minute, but there should be billions of transitional creatures and not one fossil of it becoming a bird. And you might object and say, well, Archaeopteryx, I would say, no, it wasn't a flightless feathered dinosaur. It was a perching bird that could fly, and it had a bird brain. If you saw this bird sitting on a tree limb outside your house, you would say, wow, look at that crazy looking bird. Dinosaurs, they got solid bones, heavy tails for balance, short arms and scales, relatively low metabolism, in and out lungs. Birds are the opposite. Hollow bones, centrally balanced, lightweight feathers with asymmetrical veins. And if you look at a bird flight feather, it's incredibly, incredibly advanced versus the little fluffy stuff underneath its belly. Hooks and grooves, high metabolism rate, strong muscles for flight and tendons that support bone structure, and a different lung system. They're incredibly different from dinosaurs. So you got to make that leap. And this bird here is just that. It's a bird with teeth and an extended backbone. And yes, there's been some recent findings. Oh, look, the dinosaurs, we found some with feathers on them. And I'll accept that, okay? But that's a long, long way from flight, a long way. And it doesn't even begin to ask, how could a feather evolve by itself? That's another question. So some of the things that we think are evidence, we're going to look a little bit closer at and see they still have issues. But we have someone coming to the rescue. Punctuated equilibrium gets introduced here to propose these known gaps. And it's a colorful term, back from '72 with Eldridge and Stephen Jay Gould. This guy is a bigwig evolutionist. And he brought the term up to denote a mysterious hypothetical process of rapid evolution in small populations. He says there's a gap, there's gaps. So he had a theory. Let's say there was just a rapid event happen, boom. Really, and I refer to him as Gould and the American Museum people. You'll see that later, because he was frustrated by the utter failure to find the evidence, the missing links that Darwin claimed would vindicate his theory. So he offered up a theory for us, and this is my fake Gould quote. And imagine him in a pub somewhere with his buddies. He says, "Okay, we thought Darwin had to work by very small steps. Okay, a couple of mutations at a time, but okay, hear me out. What if evolution can take an occasional giant leap?" Then the laughter dies down in the pub. He says, wait, no, just think about it. Well, of course, the more people thought about it, more people gravitated towards this, and it has some legitimacy in science now, which is scary. But there's also another name for punctuated equilibrium, Imagine when, the princess kisses the frog, what happens after that? That's kind of what he's proposing, that evolution can go bang and do something completely different and break the rules of these slow, small steps, slow, small DNA changes. So I'm picking on Gould, yes, I am, but he's going to kick back in a minute, so hang on. So problem, people know this, such as, you have this imaginary process, it might help explain the universal absence of transitional fossils, but there's no genetic evidence behind it. And even as Professor Thompson said at Yale, the mechanism of evolution is still the central mystery. How did it happen? He's saying we still don't know how it happened. And I went to the wiki and read a little bit about punctuated equilibrium. And really, they take creationists to task for misusing the concept. But if you boil down and distill what they're really saying is, the idea is still defended, since it's obviously true, as there are gaps that need explaining. Okay, so we bring this theory in to explain gaps. So science is starting to diverge into a little bit of fantasy. And even Stephen Jay Gould, still frustrated. But now let's fast forward to 84. He's still frustrated. He says, I regard the failure to find a clear vector of progress in life's history as the most puzzling fact of the fossil record. So even, what people were claiming to be transitional forms, he wasn't impressed. He said, guys, there should be a lot of steps and a lot of fossils. Here's my translation of Gould again. The fossil record says something completely different than what it should say. I wonder what's wrong with the fossil record, is what he's saying. So there's no evidence of slow change. Stephen Staley, a friend of Gould, and he's certainly a devout, punctuated equilibriumist, very fancy award-winning guy. He says the known fossil record fails to document a single example of phylentic evolution, which is evolution that is slow, uniform, and gradual, and accomplishing a major morphologic transition, and hence offers no evidence that the gradualistic model can be valid. So he's bemoaning the fact that there's gaps, that it doesn't really give any clear record. So here's my translation of Dr. Stanley. It's hard for me to believe in Darwin's model. I don't see the fossil evidence. Let's face it, the fossil evidence is overwhelming. But since we know there is no God and thus evolution must be true, I can believe that giant leaps of evolution occurred rapidly. To explain the huge gaps in the fossil record, such a phenomena certainly fits the data more accurately. Again, we're down to this again, in so many steps. And here's a big one. This is back, I know, from '79, Dr. Colin Patterson. He's a senior paleontologist at the most prestigious national history museum in the world. He says, gradualism, it's Darwinism, is a concept I believe in, not just because of Darwin's authority, but because my understanding of genetics seems to demand it. Yet Gould and the American Museum people, there's what I'm talking about, they're hard to contradict when they say there are no fossil transitions, no fossil records. As a paleontologist myself, I am much occupied with the philosophical problems of identifying ancestral forms in the fossil records. And I would add, he's responding here to a critic who said, hey, the book you have, why didn't you include just one picture of a transitional form? Why? He says, you say that I should at least show a photo of the fossil from which each type of organism was derived. I will lay it on the line. There is not one such fossil for which one can make a watertight argument. So Gould, he finally sees something that he likes. He sees an arrangement of fossils that seem to undoubtedly point to a clear evolutionary upward mobility. This is what he saw. He saw some fossils that people put together, Pagacetus on up to blue whale, for example, big whales. And he was he was almost giddy. You can hear his quote and you can feel the joy in his heart. I want you to listen to what Gould's words and just imagine a man who's been frustrated all his life that the fossil record doesn't show those thousands of transitional forms. You know, you have to make these wild guesses of what happened. And listen to him talk. The embarrassment of past absence has been replaced by the bounty of new evidence and by the sweetest series of transitional fossils that evolutionists could ever hope to find. I cannot imagine a better tale for popular presentation of science or a more satisfying and intellectually based political victory over lingering creationist opposition. Can you feel the joy in this man's heart? Finally, vindication. I'll tell you, I give Gould a lot of credit. You know, he refused to drink the evolutionary Kool-Aid that others so often refuse to question. He was a voice that said, "Come on, guys, come on, seriously, let's get a better theory." I give him credit, but is he getting the last word? Let me look. Let's look. And even after he said that, people had more evidence, more fossils to put into this line here. More came. And yes, you know, this seems intimidating. Can you imagine your textbook being taught, this is proof, unquestionable? These are real fossils. I will certainly say that. These are real fossils. And it seems extremely intimidating. But let's look a little closer. Let's look a little closer. These first two are fully terrestrial fossils, no doubt about that. These guys probably, certainly, like a sea lion, you know, partially terrestrial, partially aquatic. These guys, fully aquatic, in the water all the time. But I would say, Mr. Gould, not so fast. The fossils exist, yes, but the arrows we see here, purely imaginary. That's human imposed. Biologists do not agree that any one of these could evolve into another. And why is that? Well, that they all have features that they would have to lose in order to become the next form. You know, all of the walking whales, these guys right here, they're either fully terrestrial animals or they're amphibious land animals like sea lions or otters. And the most important transitions of all, you know, from amphibious, this guy, to Durodon, those are missing from here to here. This giant leap is missing. And so here are a few key missing things. And I'm just going to go over three. There's really at least 19 obvious ones that you could point to. So we're going to pause here and contemplate how evolution can come and rescue this poor amphibian right here. Or I should say, yeah, how is he going to get to becoming, could be like a sea lion, a sea otter, whatever, to a whale. You know, he desperately wants to get there unconsciously. So let's help him out. Let's talk about blowholes. Imagine a blowhole. This guy does not have one, and this guy does. How do you evolve a blowhole? Think about it. You need to have some sort of cut, some sort of slit to begin to develop there. And one of your buddies might say, "Hey, what is that thing on your neck?" And of course, you're Durodon. You say, I don't know. I was born that way. You know, is there a purpose right now for that thing? You know, how is it going to open up? How's it going to make muscles that can close up highly tight so you can dive thousands of feet into the water?
Hold on for a second, Tim.
Yeah.
It looks like I always thought that the evolutionary model went from the sea to land and not the other way around.
Oh, this is, yeah, this is the rear end of it. Yeah, this guy came from the sea, from the water. Okay. And now to make a whale, you got to have a mammal and go back in the water and lose a lot of your typical mammalian characteristics, right?
Okay.
Okay, we're at the tail end. Yeah, this guy, I've skipped all his long evolutionary history. He was the fish that came out of the water and became a mammal. So so we're looking at this one section here. So
Okay,
imagine a blowhole.
so all these other guys after how do you say Indohuis? All those guys are they're terrestrial creatures.
You got a fully land-loving animal, begins to get into the water, begins to develop some fins and maybe a tail to help him swim, and gets more and more fish-like as he needs those things less and less, and he needs flippers. So he says, okay, I'll evolve some flippers, and does that. And I got to breathe I got to hold my breath really good, and so I develop a blowhole. And here I'm just trying to get you to think, how can something like that evolve? It's so intricate, hundreds of parts, so much cooperation with your body. Each step has to have a purpose. So a cut on the back of your neck is not purposeful, I would contend. And then you got to connect that to your breathing system, right? And it has to close up tight to be able to go down in the water, and then all of a sudden open up, when the well surfaces. So many things have to happen. Just try to think about something evolving and what's required. That's what's missing here. That's the blowhole. Then there's
so Tim,
yeah.
I'm just getting the process right in my brain. So you're saying the guy at the bottom, he evolved out of water. He was a fish, and then he became
a mammal.
Terrestrial. But then the evolutionists said, oh my gosh, there's a mammal in the water. How did a mammal get in the water? So then they decided, okay, that guy at the bottom must have evolved over time and became a mammal in the water.
Exactly. He went back in the water for whatever reason. I mean, maybe that's where most of the food was at. Jumps in the water, and then there's some mutations in his prodigy, and one of these guys can swim better now in the water, so he's preferred. So he stays in the water more, and slowly begins to evolve all the things you need to swim 30 miles per hour in the water. Okay, that's the theory. Yes. And this is the classic example of proof based on real fossils that a mammal went back in the water and evolved into I don't know how big whales are, 50 tons? I forget. They're huge. Yes, Joe.
The time scale with this is important too. So it's not just like a fish turns into a mouse or some other mammal and then pops back to an aquatic animal.
Right.
In that time.
It's about 8 million years, I believe, is what the proposed time scale is. Right. Good point.
Well, and you bring up the Cambrian explosion. Well, that's 60 million years, and that's broken up into 5 stages. Although you can argue that stages in anything are just us arbitrarily trying to classify things.
Based on anatomy, yeah, right.
Because we even do this with like mental health and stuff like that in terms of classifying. But and there are even more links here than than this paper shows. They found one at least as recent as 2019.
Right, they have, and it was dated after some of these key steps, and it was kind of a low level. There's a lot of things. I'm sure you can put more. I'm sure more animals existed that might look whalish, that might look more like an otter, like a sea lion or whatever. Yes, in 8 million years, absolutely. I'm saying to you, okay, can this happen in 8 million years? Is really the question. So from the fossils, there's a lot of things missing that we need, because one can argue that these are simply extinct animals that existed, that were created.
Well, and I'm not exactly sure where you count the date of the Earth, because you haven't said that so far, but it becomes very hard for some of these things to all exist, all die in a frame of a short Earth, certainly. It
Why is
becomes a
that?
lot harder when
You're saying,
you
well, you think it's too crowded for them to exist?
well, and you've got species in Antarctica that are cold-blooded,
Right.
and things. Ultimately, what I'm kind of trying to get out is that. So you had a quote from Gould from 84 and then 94. So
Right.
10 years had happened there.
Right.
So he was skeptical of a lot of the absence, but then they found more evidence in the fossil record. And
Right.
where I'm having trouble when I'm having trouble with a lot of the creationist arguments is that it seems that these are very much based around stuff we either don't know, and then when we find it out, making that God of the gaps into a smaller and smaller gap. There is a lot that's unknown about things like the Cambrian explosion and stuff like that.
Right.
But more gets found out. They find fossils of cyanobacteria in Australia, for instance, and things like that. And the more that gets found out, the more you're going to, I feel, unintentionally pigeonhole God as opposed to actually
Highlighting his creative capabilities.
glorifying him to a certain extent.
Right.
If you know what I mean.
Yeah, I do. Yeah, no, you're right. If you say, I don't know how this happened, maybe God stepped in and snapped his fingers. Okay, that's one way it could happen. I would argue that's probably the only way it could possibly happen. That's what I would say. Because so many things have to happen over a short geological time scale. Millions of years is a blink of an eye, right? To create such things. And I would argue, and this is where you would get laughed at as a scientist to suggest that this happened miraculously, right? There has that's just how it is. Let me finish up here, and then we can talk more. So I would say not so fast. There's so many things that have to change, and there's no evidence that it happened, is what I'm saying. Imagine a fluke. This thing right here, this tail thing here, moves independently. And think of all the ways, all the thousands of things that have to happen to get this thing to evolve and work independent of the tail, which also goes up and down this thing. It's just incredible to think about. And so if you don't believe in a God, it needs so much faith to think that could happen on its own. And then one of my favorite one, you have to evolve internal testicles, which means this guy had external ones, and they had to somehow evolve inside the animal, and not just that, but evolve an internal heating system to keep them warm. And what happens first? Do they evolve inside with no heating system? Well, then you have a sterile well. And as Dr. Wells said, that is no link in anybody's evolutionary chain. Or did the heating system evolve first for no reason, waiting for the testicles to move inside? If you stop and think about it, it doesn't make much sense. And that sound you heard was Gould turning over in his grave. He thought this was the best evidence. He had like 5 fossils, 6. And that really is your best evidence when there's, literally thousands and thousands of missing things that don't exist. And he feels vindicated. Well, I would say, sorry, Gould, you're not vindicated. And I would say, and this is one of my famous original quotes, that's not so famous, but I like it. Evolution makes a lot of sense until you stop and think about it. So all I'm saying is stop and think how it could have happened, what would have had to have happened, and there's no evidence that it could happen, and we certainly can't go in the lab, or we don't, and show that it could happen. Even minor complexity we can't generate in a lab. So there has to be putting on some whistles and bells have to go off in our head here. And so, and I say here it is again, and this is another, look at this fossil record. It makes perfect sense until you stop and think about how this possibly could have happened over a mere 20 million years when you need so many millions of mutations to happen. And next week, we're going to talk about the rules that guide mutations. We know so much more. about the rules and how things can literally evolve and not evolve, and how long it takes for one mutation, for one piece of DNA to change relative to another piece of DNA that has to remain constant. We know the rules. And so let's apply those rules. And okay, we can argue, okay, the fossils are missing. They were there, just didn't get fossilized. Get over it, Tim. Okay, now let's go look at the DNA next week and see if it follows what rules it follows. Because DNA drives mutations and drives evolution, right? So when does faith break down into sheer stupidity? I asked that question last week. Darwin hoped that continued fossil excavation would shed clear light on his proposed mechanism to complexity. I say 170 years later, honest paleontologists admit the evidence does not exist in the fossil record. Yet, the wagons are circled. A scientist who questions the mechanism is seldom handed the podium. Seldom, if ever. And any scientist with faith knows the consequences of questioning the central paradigm out loud in public. You don't get tenure. You do not get tenure. Bottom line, if you're an evolutionist who says God does not exist, my friend, I say you have a lot of faith, and I'm envious, even though that might be a sin. So here's the good news: you can keep the truth bottled up for only so long. So next week, the fossils really let us down. We had hoped to see a clear history, just like Darwin. We hoped. We didn't see it. We were told evolution is slow. Now this is about next week. We're told that there are no convincing experiments to test evolution. Good news, wrong. And very recently, since the early 2000s, so we can read the DNA incredibly well now. It's sequenced easily relative to 1999. So imagine the excitement of evolutionists. We finally can examine an organism's entire DNA at will and clearly show how new features evolve. Here's a spoiler alert: things aren't quite what we expected. So I would say to everybody, keep the faith, but please, let's be reasonable about it. Okay, thanks a lot, guys. I appreciate it. Take care.